A French factory rolled out something almost nobody expected in 1967, a plain-looking family car with a hatch instead of a conventional boot, and it was largely ignored outside France. Yet this overlooked little car from Poissy helped prove a formula that Volkswagen, Ford, Toyota, and countless others would eventually build around. Wait till you hear who ended up getting most of the credit. Which hatchback did your family own first? Comment below. Poissy's design office had a blunt problem to solve in 1962. Simca's only real seller, the rear-engined Simca 1000, was beginning to lose ground, and nothing else in the lineup could replace it. Executives needed a car built for the next decade, not a facelift for the last one. 1963 brought the deal that changed everything. Chrysler bought a controlling stake in Simca that year, and the American money came with real ambition attached. A year later, the American parent approved a completely new project, aiming for production by the summer of 1967, a brutally short runway for a car being developed almost from scratch. Testing settled the engine layout before styling ever got a say. Simca's engineers considered both transverse and longitudinal placement, and the transverse arrangement eventually won the argument. Fiat had experimented with the concept already, but it was still unusual in a European family car. Power for the new project came from an old family member. Engineers took the larger 1.1-liter unit already running in the Simca 1000 range and adapted it for the new engine bay, mounting it transversely and keeping the bonnet line relatively low. The block itself wasn't revolutionary. Where it sat, and what it drove, changed everything. An engine swap was never going to be enough on its own, though. Simca's engineers were combining several ideas that were still unusual in an affordable family car, and the boldest one sat behind the passenger compartment, not under the bonnet. Front-wheel drive was the first major piece. Disc brakes at the front and rack and pinion steering came next, paired with independent suspension at all four corners, double wishbones up front, and semi-trailing arms at the rear, both working with torsion bars instead of conventional coil springs. Few ordinary family saloons in 1963 offered a combination like this. A subframe carried the engine, gearbox, and front suspension as one complete unit, bolted separately from the main body structure. That arrangement helped isolate the passenger body from mechanical vibration and made the front mechanical package easier to assemble and service as a single unit. Behind the rear seats sat the real gamble. Instead of a conventional boot lid, the car received a full-width rear hatch, while the rear seats could fold flat to transform the passenger area into useful cargo space. Nobody at a French ministry meeting in 1962 had necessarily written "folding rear seats" into the brief. Somebody at Poissy decided the car needed them anyway. Traditionalists inside Simca's own engineering ranks pushed back hard. A saloon with such a large rear opening, some argued, risked looking and behaving more like a delivery van than a respectable family car. Their objections went nowhere. Chrysler's backing and the 1967 deadline left little room for a debate about automotive dignity. None of this came cheap. Every one of these features added cost, complexity, and engineering risk to a car aimed at ordinary families rather than enthusiasts with money to spare. Engineers had built something remarkable on paper. Whether ordinary buyers would actually want it was still an open question, and Simca was about to find out from a public that had never seen this particular combination before. Sardinia hosted the first major press drives, oddly enough. Simca chose the island for early testing and media demonstrations before the car reached the Paris Motor Show. Journalists who drove it came away impressed by how much larger and more sophisticated it felt than its price suggested. The Paris reaction soon confirmed that first impression. The range offered 3- and 5-door hatchbacks alongside estate and commercial versions. Buyers could also choose different engine outputs and transmission options, giving the 1100 a level of flexibility that was unusual for an affordable French family car in 1967. Would ordinary buyers actually want something this unfamiliar? A press car impressing journalists on a closed road was one thing. Convincing ordinary French families to hand over their money was another matter entirely, and that answer was about to arrive faster than anyone at Poissy expected. 138,242 units. That's how many Simca 1100s rolled out of Poissy in 1968 alone, the car's first full year on sale. Numbers like that don't happen by accident in a market as competitive as France's. French buyers didn't just accept the 1100. They embraced the practicality of a large rear opening, folding seats, front-wheel drive, and a compact body that could carry people or cargo without demanding a large car. Sales continued climbing through the late 1960s and 1970s, eventually passing 2 million cars before production finally ended. Rivals noticed. Renault introduced its own hatchback solutions, while Austin and other manufacturers gradually moved toward similar packaging. The important point wasn't that every rival copied the Simca directly. It was that the market was beginning to prove the practicality of the formula Simca had committed to in 1967. A car this practical and affordable, selling in these numbers, should have changed the industry overnight. Instead, much of the industry took years to catch up. If you're the type who likes watching an entire industry get proven wrong in slow motion, stick around, because the biggest part of this story is still ahead. And hitting subscribe means you won't miss it. Why didn't everyone else copy the formula immediately? That's the part of the story most retrospectives skip, and it says more about the industry's stubbornness than it does about the Simca 1100's engineering. Fiat launched the 128 in 1969, 2 years after the 1100 had already demonstrated how effective a transverse engine, front-wheel drive family car could be. But Fiat chose a conventional 3-box saloon body for the 128, keeping a separate boot rather than embracing the full hatchback package. Citroën followed with the GS in 1970, while Alfa Romeo launched the Alfa Sud in 1971. Both were technically ambitious front-wheel drive family cars, yet neither initially made the Simca's exact hatchback and folding seat formula the center of its identity. Austin's Allegro arrived in 1973. It offered front-wheel drive and plenty of engineering ambition, but again, the initial range did not make the full hatchback concept the defining feature. 6 years after the Simca gamble, the industry was still deciding how far it wanted to go. 4 major manufacturers, 4 different decisions, and no immediate rush to reproduce the entire formula. Coincidence can explain one company missing an opportunity. It becomes harder to explain when the same hesitation appears across several countries. Ask engineers and executives why, and the excuses were remarkably familiar. Retooling factories around a new body style was expensive. A folding rear seat seemed unnecessary to buyers who simply wanted dependable transportation. Executives kept treating practicality as a compromise instead of recognizing it as the product itself. Pride played a part too. Nobody wanted to admit that an inexpensive French family car had already found an answer their own engineers were still debating. That stubbornness didn't last forever. One manufacturer was about to take the basic formula, refine it with modern design and manufacturing discipline, and become the name most people would eventually associate with the modern hatchback. Poissy kept building the 1100 while the competition slowly changed around it. 15 years of production, multiple versions, and more than 2 million sales made the car impossible to dismiss as a strange French experiment. Comfort mattered here as much as practicality. Torsion bar suspension tuned for French roads gave the 1100 a reputation for absorbing rough surfaces without turning every journey into a punishment. Buyers noticed the difference. Nobody in France needed convincing anymore. The rest of the industry still did. Somewhere outside France, though, all that dismissiveness was setting up the biggest twist in the story. A German manufacturer was watching too, and unlike several rivals, this one would eventually turn the basic idea into something the entire world remembered. 7 years is a long time to watch a good idea sit unclaimed. That's almost exactly how long it took before another car arrived that would redefine how the world talked about the hatchback. The wait was almost over. 1974 is the year most car histories point to when they explain who made the modern hatchback a mainstream phenomenon. That's when Volkswagen launched the Golf, and within a few years, it became the car against which European manufacturers measured themselves. Nobody's wrong to admire the Golf. It earned its reputation with sharp handling, efficient packaging, strong build quality, modern styling, and a marketing machine Simca never had. What many histories leave out is the date stamped on the Simca's own launch 7 years earlier. 7 years doesn't sound like much on its own. Stretch it across an entire industry, though, and it becomes something closer to a wasted opportunity. Years in which European families continued buying conventional saloons while a more practical formula had already been demonstrated in France. Count the manufacturers that hesitated. Fiat, Citroën, Alfa Romeo, Austin, and others eventually moved toward the hatchback concept, but most did so only after the market had begun proving that compact family cars could be designed around practicality rather than a separate boot. That isn't the twist, though. The real twist is what happened to the company that had the head start. Chrysler now controlled Simca, and by the mid-1970s the company needed a successor to the aging 1100. The replacement was called the Horizon, and it arrived in 1978, after the hatchback market had already become far more crowded. Look underneath the Horizon's new sheet metal, and you'll find plenty of 1100 DNA. Its engines, gearbox, and other major mechanical components carried the old car's influence forward, while the basic front-wheel drive philosophy remained intact. But the Horizon was not simply an untouched 1100 underneath a new body. By then, the rest of the industry had caught up. The Golf had momentum, the Renault 5 had become a major success. Fiat, Citroën, Austin, and others had their own hatchback offerings. The idea Simca had helped prove was no longer unusual. It had become the new normal. Ask what that timing cost Simca. The Horizon never became the sales phenomenon the 1100 had been. It entered a market filled with competitors that had finally learned the lesson, while Simca itself was struggling to turn its early advantage into lasting leadership. Timing, in the end, decided more than engineering ever did. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with. The credit didn't simply move from one badge to another. The entire history of the modern hatchback became associated with the manufacturers that perfected the concept later. Every modern hatchback on the road carries some version of the formula Simca 11000 helped prove: transverse engine, front-wheel drive, a large rear hatch, and seats that could transform passenger space into cargo space. Simca didn't invent every individual element, but it showed how powerful the combination could be in an affordable family car. Volkswagen refined that formula brilliantly. That's why the Golf deserves its reputation. Refinement matters. So does knowing where the idea's most important steps came from. Somewhere between a factory in Poissy and a factory in Wolfsburg, the story became much simpler than the reality. One car became the symbol of the modern hatchback, while the earlier French machine that helped prove the market for the concept slowly disappeared from public memory. Engineers who worked on the Poissy project rarely get asked about any of this today. Their work became part of the ordinary background of automotive history, even though the decisions they made in the 1960s would eventually become standard practice across the industry. The world eventually caught up. By then, the car that had helped prove the formula had already been replaced, its successor fighting in a market that looked nothing like the one the original had entered. Simca had not invented the modern hatchback by itself. It had done something almost as important. It showed an entire industry that ordinary families would pay for practicality when practicality was engineered into the car from the beginning. And that is why the Simca 1100 matters. Not because every later hatchback copied it piece by piece, but because it helped make the idea impossible to ignore. Simca helped build the blueprint, then watched Volkswagen become the name most people remembered. But there's another French car buried in automotive history the same way, and its story is even stranger than this one. Subscribe now, and I'll show you exactly which car that is.